So if the larger strategy is one of integration marketing, we can now start chunking this down a little bit and get closer to the tactical level when we look at specific applications of integration marketing. Now, there's all sorts of ways that we can use integration marketing, but that illustrates sort of the broader principle, and it also shows how tactically it chunks down a little bit.
Hello, fabulous person. Beate Gillette here, the Growth Architect. Welcome back to the Business Growth Architect Show, where we bring you cutting-edge business strategies from some of the world's most successful entrepreneurs, business transformation experts, and visionaries who want to help you to scale your impact. Look for one tangible strategy that you can take back and implement right away. And now back to our guest. Hello and welcome back. This is your host, Beate Gillette, and this is another episode for the Business Growth Architect Show. And I have a guest today who is aiming to make things simple for you. So I want to welcome to the show, Mark Joyner. Mark, welcome and tell us everything we need to know about you.
Everything. Okay. Well, so I'll start with the broad strokes about business related stuff. So before I was in business, I was in the U.S. military. I served in the U.S. Army intelligence community, was in the military for about 8 years. While I was in the military, I was doing internet business in the early 1990s. So where most people got to know me was, I was doing a lot of pioneering work in digital marketing back in that day. We didn't call it digital marketing then. We didn't really know what to call it. But I started the first ebook publishing company, started the first ad tracking company, which is where we invented the ad tracking pixel, which is something that I'm sure everybody is using every day. Well, even if you don't know, you are using it every day. And we were the first company to do, what people now call online marketing funnels. Funnels existed before us, but we were the first ones to do it digitally way back when. Going to fast forward a bit. Now I'm running a company called Simpleology, and Simpleology is solving a problem that I knew was going to come about way back in the early days of the internet. There's this gap between how much information we can process in conscious working memory and how much information there is available to us. And the amount of information available to us is increasing, but not only increasing, it's increasing exponentially. In 2004, I believe, Eric Schmidt he was a former CEO of Google, observed that the amount of data that we were entering into the stream was about 5 exabytes of data per day. What makes that interesting is that if you take all of the data amassed from the dawn of human history to the end of 2003, that was about 5 exabytes. By 2004, we were putting 5 exabytes of data into the stream every single day. And the rate at which we're doing that is only increasing. So I knew way back when that this was going to be an exceedingly important challenge to solve for everybody. So that was how Simpleology came about. It gives people a way to navigate to what I call the complexity gap, the gap between how much information is available and how much information you can do in conscious working memory. I'm also an author. I've got, over a dozen books in print. A few of them were bestsellers, some print in 25 languages, some used in schools. Anyway, there's a shotgun blast of who Mark Joyner is for you to get started.
Yes, thank you for that. And obviously, I want to point out for the audience that in our interviews, we can only cover this much, and we do our very best to give you the strategy to take home and to implement right away. But obviously, I'm pretty blessed and grateful that I get to talk to exciting people. And there is a lot more than the half hour we typically spend together. So go check out Mark some more. So Mark, you mentioned the information overload, and I'm paraphrasing this, very simply right now. And so take me through sort of the process of how did you even come up with that? Because I think for most people, this is like something that it's like with addiction, right? So it's just a little bit more every day, and you don't even recognize it's happening. What made you even pay attention to, wait a minute, something's going on here?
Yeah. Well, it was a number of things, right? One was I had a famous farewell from the digital marketing world for a while around 2002. I just got tired of being a digital marketing guru and said, okay, I'm leaving this whole thing. And a lot of people were emailing me, asking me for advice about what they should do about their fledgling businesses. And what I observed was that none of them really needed marketing advice. They had perfectly good ideas. The problem was that their productivity was just completely dysfunctional. And I thought, wow, I've really got to help solve for these guys their productivity problem more than their, I don't have a good marketing idea problem, which was a false problem. That combined with just my preference to always go back to first principles and observational thinking. I'm always looking at what's actually going on around what I can know that's going on. And, and then there's all sorts of, faux signals out there, put up by propagandists and whatnot to distract us from what's really happening. But if you attempt to observe, the trends of things using the best data possible, observe what you can see with your own eyes, things will reveal themselves to you that are not visible to most people because most everybody else is watching, what Plato called the shadows on the cave and the allegory of the cave. So that, helped me understand that this was a real and present and palpable and increasingly serious problem.
I like that a lot because I think that from what I see is that a lot of times business owners don't know what the issue is.
Yes.
So they, number one, the question is what you want is already complicated for most. They don't even know where they want to go.
That's right.
And then the second question is, well, if you were to know where you wanted to go, now what is prohibiting you from getting there? And that's usually the second sort of big pause in the conversation with them. So now let's talk about strategy. So obviously from your background in the military and the way you show up in the world, strategy is a big part of your life. So what is strategy for you, Mark?
Such a powerful question. It's a very oft misused word, I would say. And for me, it's like this. Von Clausewitz is famous for having said that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. Mike Tyson said it a little bit more eloquently when he said, everybody got a plan until you got punched in the face, right? And they're both more or less saying the same thing. We can make a hypothesis about what's going to happen, but if our enemy is smart, our enemy is going to move. Now, I use enemy as a metaphor. You can, speak of the enemy as the customer. You can speak of the enemy as the marketplace. It's a metaphorical way of viewing the world. And I think military metaphors are exceedingly useful in business on many, many levels. So to me, I look at strategy like this. Tactics are what you do when you know what to do, and strategy is what you do when you don't. So most of the time, we don't know what to do. A tactic might work for a time, but the landscape is going to change. The battlefield is going to evolve. Therefore, we have to have something to inform us in the sea of infinite decisions. What kind of decision is going to be more likely to bring about a positive result for us? If you have an intelligently designed strategy, that strategy will inform those decisions that you make in the heat of battle. Now, that's the simplest way I can talk about it. Feel free to dig in more, but I think that's the most foundational and succinct way that we can begin to have a meaningful conversation about strategy.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe let's start and talk about what's a tactic compared to that, right? So is a tactic something that's a little bit more short-lived, or it's something that you try? So tell us about what's a tactic for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a tactic is in fact something that you want to do, that's short-lived. It's usually local, right? So let's imagine, during the Korean War, and by the way, strategy and tactics are not always perfectly distinct, right? They often blend into each other, and strategy often informs individual tactics. So you will see lots of nitpicking about, well, is that really a tactic? Is it really a strategy? It doesn't really matter. It's just, it's more of a sensibility about the way you think about it, right? So, when in the Korean War, we were pushed down to the bottom of the Pusan perimeter, General MacArthur had the strategic notion that what he wanted to do was he wanted to land somewhere that was unexpected by the North Koreans. And there was a little window in Incheon. There was a harbor there where you only had about a 1 hour window during which you could land. Now, there were many, many places where MacArthur could have employed this particular strategy. There are many different ways he could have gone about it. One could say that it was a strategic approach to attacking the battle to find a landing location that was unexpected somewhere. And then tactically, what it broke down to was the very specific location. Now, if I say that, I'm sure there are going to be people watching who are, military strategists who are going to quibble with some of that. And it's fine. They're perfectly useful and reasonable quibbles to have. I mean, even saying it, I could say, yeah, it's not 100% perfect of an answer, but you get the idea, right?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think that, what we're trying to achieve is that we want to give entrepreneurs, founders, business owners some pointers on how to get out of this insanity that is running a business or the constant running after things, and to really get in front of it. So personally, to me, is it a tactic or a strategy? Whatever they can call it, they can call it. However, because this is a strategic podcast, I do want to make the differentiation, because I believe that an overall strategy is absolutely critical for business owners to have. And then the tactics and how to figure out which tactic is going to be part of the strategy that actually achieves the results to make that strategy happen is an important distinction for me personally. And I give maybe an example, and maybe you have an additional example so people really understand what we're talking about here, is that I run an Instagram tactic as part of my overall strategy of authority platform building. I also ran a tactic on Facebook. I found that the tactic on Facebook was not achieving the results that I was that I wanted, because the people that are on Facebook 24/7 are generally not the type of business owners that I want to reach. My business owners that I want to reach are not on that platform, certainly not between the hours of 9 to 5, right? They might check in the evening, or they might check in the morning, but they don't really do that other than to run ads for the business. And so I had to stop that tactic because it wasn't fitting in my overall strategy. So I wonder, do you have an example, maybe something along the lines that you can share so we drive that point home, difference between a tactic and a strategy?
Yeah. So, let me just say one thing that you did there, which is quite good. And that was, you can say that you've got a strategy of authority building, but then over time, your interaction with the battlefield informed you that you need to revise that strategy, right? So, okay, it's not just, authority building with everyone. It's authority building with this group of people. This is quite an important difference in business, I would say, right? So I'll give you, one of my favorite strategies, probably my favorite growth strategy. I wrote a book about, it's called Integration Marketing. And this is this notion of putting one marketing process inside another marketing process to benefit from it. One of the easiest to understand examples of that was, and by the way, this is a growth strategy that you can employ without an ad budget, right? It allows you to create steady, consistent income in your business of quality, highly targeted customers coming in without having to spend money on advertising, without the volatility that causes. So if one were to look at that as a strategy, one particular tactical approach that Microsoft using that strategy of growth, and this was their first big move. And in fact, without this, Microsoft would have never been Microsoft. They had a negotiation with IBM. IBM was entering the personal computing business. They didn't have an operating system. They went to Bill Gates, who claimed that he had one. There's a bunch of side information about that a lot of people elevate as the most important part, that like, oh, he didn't even have the operating system. He had to pay somebody $50,000. They say that's the important part of the story. That's important. It's interesting, but it pales in comparison to the real story here, right? The real story is when Bill Gates was sitting down at that negotiation table with IBM, IBM said, okay, so, it sounds like, you guys have an operating system will do the job. So, okay, we'll do it. And Bill Gates said, well, okay, I have two conditions though. The first condition is you need to allow the customer relationship to remain with us. Now, IBM at the time, they said famously, well, sure, that's fine. Everybody knows all the money is in the hardware, right? Which we can laugh at now. And, it was just, typical big company hubris. They're not seeing things. They're resting on their laurels. They're getting complacent, right? This happens to everybody, right? And I'll come back to why these two negotiation points are so important. So number two was, hey, and you also need to reserve the right for us to be able to do this with other outfits. Now, that particular tactic, that specific tactic, was enormously powerful, and it informs the rest of the growth strategy that Microsoft has used everywhere. In fact, almost all of the greatest fortunes in the history of the world, I would argue, follow this pattern. So if you know that it costs about 10 times as much to acquire a new customer as it does to sell something to an existing customer, it's an estimate, but it's a pretty damn good one as marketing truisms go. It's generally pretty true. Then you have to really admire the fact that Bill Gates negotiated his way into a steady stream of perfectly qualified customers without him having to spend a single dime on advertising. IBM just handed this customer stream to him on a silver platter, and all of the upgrades that they needed to pay for the operating system, that was all gravy, right? And not only that, he was able to go do this with HP and Compaq and Dell and Gateway and all these other companies that cropped up after the fact because of those two single negotiation points. So if the larger strategy is one of integration marketing, we can now start chunking this down a little bit and get closer to the tactical level when we look at specific applications of integration marketing. Now, there's all sorts of ways that we can use integration marketing, but that illustrates sort of the broader principle, and it also shows how tactically it chunks down a little bit.
Yes. And so integration marketing, if you were to give me a definition for that to tell my audience, integration marketing is what exactly?
So I'll give you a paraphrase of the sort of the nerdy technical definition that I use in the book, right? Which is the integration of a unit of marketing value in a traffic stream or a transaction stream. Okay. Now, a traffic stream is anywhere where people are converting, anywhere there are eyeballs. It could be physical, it could be digital, it could be anywhere. That's a traffic stream. Mm-hmm. So it could be a billboard, it could be a banner ad, it could be anything. Transaction stream is a special kind of eyeball. It's where a transaction is occurring, right? So, outside of the store, somebody might have a billboard there that's still a traffic stream. But once somebody walks into that store, if you upsell them something like a belt when they just bought a shirt, well, now that's an integration of a unit of marketing value into a transaction stream. Again, a unit of marketing value can be anything. It could be an ad. It could be the sale of a product. It could be anything at all. Now, when you know those base parameters, there's an infinite number of ways that you can apply those. And what's really interesting about it is I also have something called the integration marketing point scoring system that allows you to determine mathematically which of these integration points on a traffic or a transaction stream are going to be more likely to render a high ROI for you. So obviously, a transaction stream is going to tend to have a higher point value than a traffic stream. Mm-hmm. We already have, we know information about these guys. We know that they have credit cards. We know that they're not afraid to use them. That we know that we like a certain product. We know that they're hot about that product right now in this moment. Depending on where in the transaction stream you're integrated, that's going to have a different point value as well. So there's sort of a broad idea of what integration marketing is all about.
I like that. And so this leads me sort of to a side question here, because it sounds very data driven. So share with us, how do you measure the success of a strategy, and how does data fall into that? Because this is another thing that a lot of entrepreneurs, founders, and business owners don't understand. How do you measure? How do you know if it works or not?
Yeah, it's such a damn good question. Measuring the effectiveness of a strategy gets harder, right? It's easier to measure the effectiveness of a tactic, harder to measure the effectiveness of a strategy because there are too many unknowns. And the higher up the chain you go, the more confounded the data gets, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm measuring this particular metric, but I don't know what's causal here. And in fact, epistemologically, we might argue that we can never know causality, right? How can we know that A caused B? It's a deep philosophical question that's very interesting, actually, and it's quite a bit more challenging than most realize. But, the more localized we get about things, the more specific we get about things, the more controlled the environment is, the better the data can get, right? So, one thing that you can do, like if you're using integration marketing as a general strategy, I started the first ad tracking company many years ago. One thing I would tell people is, hey, for all of the integration marketing efforts that you have, use a link that's coded a certain way. Then you'll know that everything that has code, IMXA, XXXXX, whatever that variable is after that, that's all, that's really one really powerful way to do that. Using coding categories that start broad and go specific, that will allow you to at least a measure of the stuff that you have control over, what's working and what's not. It's such a great topic. And it's a lot subtler than people realize. When you start getting deeper into the data, people will start, telling you, they'll start becoming aware of the notion that, hey, wait a minute, just because I measured something doesn't mean it's a meaningful measurement. So how much data do you have to get to know that you know which one's the winner? Well, if you're doing a simple A/B split test, a lot of people will tell you something called the law of 25 or the law of 40. And they'll say, well, if you just get 40 responses, you pick the one that did better. Statistically, that's going to be right. That's a useful heuristic, but it doesn't really pay respect to the genuine complexities of statistics. Then someone might say, well, you need to look at the confidence interval. And that's true. Now we're getting somewhere a little bit better. But then when you really dig into it, you realize that statistics, as they use them for polling, that's describing something very different than looking at two live examples in real time. So if you really want to get more accurate data, you'll use something that almost nobody in business uses. I think I was involved in the only company that ever put something like this out there. There's another algorithm, a statistical algorithm called the statistical probability ratio test, which is more appropriate for when you're measuring two live activities in real time to find out which is more effective. So that's a very subtle, nuanced answer I'm giving folks. And I want to tell them not to despair, just collect the best data you can and make the best guess you can with the data that you've got. But be aware that in business, we generally don't have very good data. So we have to combine this, with a little bit of intuition as well.
And that was a great segment into my next question, because now I want to get a little more personal. So if I say mindset, impact, spirituality, energy, where are you with all of that? Is it just data strategy, or is there a lot more about being successful for you?
Oh man, those things are so important. I think a lot of people pretend that, none of that matters at all. Well, that's, it's just, prima facie, that's just not true. Your mindset informs your behavior in so many different ways. And whether or not you consider yourself to be a spiritual person, you have spiritual thoughts. It's just human nature. And our individual relationship with the universe, whether we downplay the importance of it or dismiss it as something that's fantastic, makes up a large amount of our waking intellectual life. So I think it would be wise to have a conscious approach to these things, because the way that we approach these things will impact the way we show up in the business world, if that's our only aim.
Well, 100%. And it's interesting. Everyone I've interviewed, without a single exception, has so far said, whether that was David Meltzer or Brad Sugars or you name them, they all say the same thing. It's all about, I got to be in that mindset. I got to see it and I got to step into it. And so in your life, because you really are one of the most strategic or clear about, the terminology and the precision in which you operate in strategy. So how do you combine that? Or what would you say to somebody who is so in their data and numbers and funnels and conversions and click-through rates? And how do we get them to understand this concept of mindfulness, spirituality? Can we?
I love it. Yeah, well, it's a good question. Can we? It depends on them and how It depends on how hardened they are. I'll give you an example that's going to be extremely divisive for a lot of people. And I know, I love actually kind of bringing up things that are divisive, because I believe that we have a problem in this world, and that we have this challenge right now where it's difficult for us to disagree with each other and remain civil. And that's a very, very serious, fundamental human problem. So are you telling me that, one of my relatives has a different feeling about Donald Trump or the COVID vaccination than I do, and we're not supposed to remain friendly anymore because we have different feelings about this? This is a very dangerous time to be in society, where we cannot be friends with each other because we have different feelings about things. So I'm saying this as a pre-entry into this, because I'm going to give an example that's very interesting, regardless where somebody sits on politics. In 2016, universally, Donald Trump was given about a 3% chance of winning across many, many different data sets. Now, whether people are for Trump or against Trump or whatever, it doesn't matter. I don't care. I have many friends who dislike the fact that I try to remain neutral on these issues, but they're different. They have varying opinions about these things, and I do my level best to be friends with them regardless. I don't really care what they think about it. What's unequivocal is that it's statistically highly improbable for a number of independent data sources to come up with the same wrong answer. Okay. Now, if you're talking about one sampling of data that says, hey, there's only a 3% chance that Trump is going to win. Well, if he wins, it's like, okay, well, it was possible, right? But when you have a whole bunch of independent data sets out there that are gathering that data independently, and they all come up with that same wrong conclusion, something's wrong. Okay. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because it was one of the most profound moments in history that illustrates exactly the point that you're talking about here. If we believe that our data is so reliable that we discount mindfulness and all these other ways of looking at things as, being a foundational way of showing up, well, then we're likely to be rather misled in surprising ways by data, right? So all I got to tell you to the listener is, okay, bucko, if you think that mindfulness isn't important and you're living your life solely on data, you're going to get slapped around in some pretty surprising ways. If you are practicing mindfulness, for example, you could look at that stuff and say, and rather than be pushed around by, propagandists who are trying to make you have an emotional reaction about this in one direction or another, you could say, oh, well, that's interesting. The data says this is not what I would expect. What can I actually know from this? Instead of going, well, that means this because I'm going to push it into my ideological box over here that I am so desperately holding on to, right? So I would say, if you're not practicing mindfulness, especially in this world right now where people are trying to push you, they're trying to push your emotional buttons to get you to come to conclusions that may or may not be in your best interest, it'd be very useful for you to practice some mindfulness, to be aware of how much control you can have over your own thoughts and your own emotions.
Very powerful. Yes. As a former photo editor and having been around journalism many, many years ago, I can say honestly that what I see right now is unrecognizable to the standards and what we used to do. There was something that was called fact checking. We were not allowed to, nothing was published unless it was fact checked. If there was a question, we had to disclose that in the article. So I find, and this is, you're really speaking to a thing that's personally extremely painful to me, because I know so many journalists and so many of my former colleagues, and you see what's happening to this. You see who is buying media companies. Yes. And the people who are buying media companies are buying a platform for that which they want to push based now under the umbrella of an established media company, because the media companies can't freaking figure out how to make money. Yep. Because truth isn't necessarily what sells right now. It is the confirmation of what I already believe in, and the rage that others are not. That's what's selling. And that is, in my eyes, as you said, so very poignantly, the very dangerous moment in our lives, in freedom of speech, and in how our ability to even get to the information that allows us to measure what is the truth here, right? It takes a lot more now to figure out what the truth is. So your point is taken 100%. And, I think Trump is a great example for that, because like him or don't like him, he's a master marketer, always was.
Oh, yeah.
Always
No
will
doubt.
be. So you can learn a lot from that. And as far as manipulation and what it takes to really turn something in your favor, even though the odds are so against you, it'll be a case study for decades to come. And people who ignore that because they have negative feelings about him, you're really missing an example that is so useful in understanding how these things work. When I remember when I first saw Trump at his first debate appearance, I said, this guy's going to win. I knew it instantly. And I was going to start writing about that, but I got distracted and other people started, covering it very, very well. But it's studying what he did is a lens through which one can look at persuasion and marketing and public relations that is very informative. Yeah, no, 100%. Well, I wished we weren't already at the end of this, because this has been such a phenomenal conversation. So, Mark, for anyone who wants to know more about you and how you look at strategy, and perhaps you can spend an extra minute or so talk about Simpleology so everybody knows what that is and what you do, and how can we find you?
Well, Simpleology is our software platform. I would like to point to something else, actually, that's a little bit more time sensitive. So I wrote a book called Your Roadmap to Money in the 2020s. I wrote it before the COVID pandemic, and it actually accurately described a lot of what's happening now. And there are a lot of other technological predictions that I make in there. And I just want to let people know I'm not some kind of a psychic. I don't make predictions like that. What I do is I look at trends and I say, these are the likely pathways that we're likely to go. I could be totally wrong, but here's the landscape as it is right now. And if you don't understand the technological trends that I'm going to explain in this book, you're going to have a very hard time understanding what's going on in the world right now, and a hard time predicting what's going to be occurring in the future. So people can get that at yourroadmaptomoney.com. And through that, they will be introduced to Simpleology and other things that I use as well. That book is available for free. I decided just to not print it and to leave it as an ebook form, because it's just so time sensitive right now. But we've had hundreds of thousands of downloads of that now, and it's getting a lot of really wonderful feedback. And a lot of people are saying, wow, now I understand, a little bit better what's actually going on. So I would encourage people to read it. It's a 357-page book, but most people read it in about 1 or 2 sittings. It's large type, lots of images. It makes these very, very complex ideas super easy to understand, which is what we're all about at Simpleology. We want to take difficult things, make them easy for people to understand. And if ever there's a time for that, it's now, because there's a lot of complex stuff going on that's impacting us on a day-to-day basis. And I think that everybody in the world kind of needs to know that these things are happening. And if they don't, it's going to be a challenge to survive. I hate to say it.
I agree with you. And, in the aftermath now, especially of what we're seeing with media, and now how the whole thing, how first the platform was granted and then the platform was completely yanked. And now how it's okay to throw off many, many more influencers and people that are outspoken about certain things.
That's right.
It is certainly something that we need to be very cognizant of and mindful of in a society right now, because being right at the end of the day isn't exactly what's going to make us happy. What makes us happy is the human experience and connecting with other people and growing from really what we are learning. So this has been really amazing, Mark. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. This podcast with Mark is about tactics and strategies, and he will give us a favorite strategy that he took and learned from no other than Bill Gates, who bought my business. So I like any example with Bill Gates and what he did with IBM. You will learn how to repeat a particular formula, integrated marketing again and again. There are 2 negotiation points that Mark is going to share with us. And we will also, of course, talk about mindset, and even that when you have an excellent strategy, you still need to follow some of the advice Mark is going to give you in this interview. So for the full interview, please listen to the podcast or watch it on YouTube. All right. And that is it for us today. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the Business Growth Architect Show. I'm your host, Beate Gillette. And that's it for us today. Thank you for listening and watching the Business Growth Architect Show. I enjoyed having you here. And for accountability, just take one of the strategies that you have heard, one thing that you can implement in your business immediately. Please leave comments. Don't forget to like and share this show. And if you have any questions about business, please put them in the comments. We are here for you. We're here to support you and help you to grow, build, and scale your own business. For more advice, please check out our website in the show notes below. Thank you again. This is Beate Gillette, the Growth Architect, and goodbye.